Welcome back. Today we're taking a careful look at the secret of Skinwalker Ranch, Season 7, Episode 9, titled Up in Smoke. If you've been following this remarkable investigation from the beginning, you already know that every new experiment is designed to answer long-standing questions about one of the most mysterious properties in America. Yet time and again, the ranch has a way of turning even the simplest scientific test into something no one anticipated. This episode is a perfect example of that pattern. At first glance, the investigation seems refreshingly straightforward. Rather than launching rockets into the sky or relying on sophisticated electronic instruments, the team turns to one of the oldest and most practical investigative techniques available. They use smoke, a simple visual tool that has long helped engineers, firefighters, and researchers observe invisible air currents, hidden ventilation paths, and subtle environmental changes. It is an uncomplicated experiment built on well-understood scientific principles, one that should produce equally straightforward observations. But on Skinwalker Ranch, very little stays straightforward for long. The focus of this investigation is once again Homestead 2, a location that has repeatedly drawn the attention of both investigators and viewers. Over the years, this isolated area has become associated with reports of unusual environmental readings, unexplained equipment behavior, and incidents that continue to challenge easy explanation. Whether those events share a common cause remains uncertain, but Homestead 2 has earned its reputation as one of the ranch's most persistently intriguing locations. The team's objective appears clear. By releasing smoke into carefully chosen areas, they hope to expose airflow patterns that cannot normally be seen. If hidden underground spaces, unexpected pressure changes, or concealed pathways exist beneath the surface, the smoke may reveal clues that electronic sensors alone could easily miss. It is a measured, logical approach that relies more on observation than speculation. Then something unexpected happens. Instead of simply answering questions about Homestead 2, the experiment begins drawing attention toward an entirely different part of the ranch. The very place investigators expected to study slowly gives way to a new mystery unfolding somewhere else. Rather than narrowing the investigation, the smoke seems to expand it, raising fresh questions about whether distant areas of the property may be connected in ways the team has not yet recognized. For investigators who have spent years trying to understand this landscape, moments like these are both exciting and frustrating. Every apparent clue seems to open another door instead of closing one. Every answer introduces another question. It is this pattern, not dramatic claims or sensational headlines, that has kept Skinwalker Ranch at the center of continuing curiosity. In this breakdown, we'll carefully examine each stage of the investigation exactly as it unfolds. We'll explore why the smoke experiment was chosen, what investigators expected to find, how events began to diverge from those expectations, and why the discoveries made during this episode may influence future investigations across the ranch. We'll also consider the possible scientific interpretations alongside the unanswered questions that continue to surround these observations. As always, our goal isn't to declare final answers where none yet exist. Instead, we'll follow the evidence, examine the investigators' reasoning, and look closely at the moments that transformed one of the simplest experiments of the season into one of its most thought-provoking mysteries. Before the first plume of smoke rises into the air, it's worth understanding why the investigation returns once again to Homestead 2. Among the many locations scattered across Skinwalker Ranch, few have generated as many lingering questions as this quiet section of the property. While other areas have captured attention with dramatic aerial phenomena or unusual instrument readings, Homestead 2 has earned its reputation through something more subtle. It is a place where ordinary experiments have repeatedly produced results that investigators struggle to explain. That history is exactly why the team continues coming back. Over the course of previous investigations, Homestead 2 has been associated with a wide range of unusual observations. Team members have reported unexpected equipment malfunctions, inconsistent sensor readings, and environmental conditions that sometimes seem to change without an obvious cause. On several occasions, experiments that appeared carefully planned produced outcomes that differed from what the investigators expected based on normal scientific principles. None of these incidents by themselves provide definitive proof of anything extraordinary. Each event could have a conventional explanation that simply has not yet been identified. But taken together, they form a pattern that is difficult for the investigators to ignore. Good scientific investigation often depends on returning to the same location under different conditions, repeating experiments, and looking for consistent results. Rather than abandoning Homestead Two because it raises difficult questions, the team views those unanswered questions as a reason to study it even more carefully. That philosophy shapes the entire approach in this episode. Instead of introducing another highly complex experiment filled with advanced electronics, the investigators decide to use a technique that is remarkably simple. Sometimes the clearest answers come not from adding more technology, but from stripping an experiment down to its fundamentals. If hidden airflow exists beneath the surface, if underground voids influence movement through the terrain, or if subtle pressure differences are affecting the environment, a visible tracer can often reveal patterns that digital sensors might overlook. This is where smoke becomes an invaluable investigative tool. For decades, engineers, building inspectors, firefighters, and environmental researchers have used smoke to study invisible air movement. Under calm conditions, smoke behaves in predictable ways. It rises because of heat, drifts according to wind direction, and responds naturally to changes in air pressure. Any unexpected movement immediately becomes something worth investigating. The team hopes the smoke will function almost like a map drawn in the air. Instead of measuring invisible forces with numbers on a computer screen, they can watch those forces unfold with their own eyes. If air is being pulled downward into hidden openings, the smoke may reveal it. If unseen channels exist beneath the surface, unusual movement could point investigators toward locations deserving closer examination. Even subtle changes in the smoke's behavior might provide valuable clues about the landscape below. Another advantage of this method is that everyone present can observe the same phenomenon simultaneously. Unlike specialized electronic instruments that require technical interpretation, smoke offers a direct visual record. Every investigator can compare what they see in real time, making it easier to discuss whether the observations match ordinary environmental behavior or suggest something more unusual. Of course, the team understands that nature itself can produce complicated airflow. Small variations in terrain, temperature, vegetation, and shifting wind currents can all influence how smoke behaves. That is why the investigators pay close attention to weather conditions before beginning the experiment. The calmer and more stable the environment, the easier it becomes to distinguish ordinary air movement from something genuinely unexpected. As preparations continue, the mood remains cautious rather than dramatic. No one assumes the smoke will reveal hidden mysteries. In fact, a completely ordinary result would still provide useful information by eliminating one possible line of inquiry. But given Homestead Two's long history of surprising investigators, there is also a quiet sense of anticipation. Experience has taught the team that even the most carefully planned experiments on this ranch have a habit of producing results that no one predicted. With the equipment in place, conditions carefully evaluated, and every observer focused on the same objective, the stage is finally set. What begins as one of the simplest experiments of the season is about to test whether Homestead Two still has more secrets waiting beneath its surface. As the investigation moves from planning to action, the atmosphere around Homestead Two is noticeably calm. There is no rush to begin and no expectation that the experiment will produce dramatic results within moments. Instead, the team approaches the test with the kind of patience that has become essential after years of working on Skinwalker Ranch. Experience has taught them that careful preparation often matters just as much as the observations themselves. Before any smoke is released, the investigators review the purpose of the experiment one final time. Every member of the team understands that the objective is not simply to create a visual effect. The smoke is being used as a scientific indicator, a way to make otherwise invisible air movement visible. If the surrounding environment behaves normally, the smoke should disperse in predictable ways. If it behaves differently, the team hopes to identify exactly where, when, and how those differences occur. Equipment is positioned deliberately around Homestead Two, with each investigator assigned a specific role. Some are responsible for releasing the smoke in controlled amounts, ensuring that the flow remains steady and consistent. Others watch from different angles so they can compare what they see from multiple viewpoints. Cameras are placed to capture the movement from a distance as well as close up, allowing the team to review the results later frame by frame if necessary. This coordinated approach is important because unusual observations can easily be misunderstood if only one person witnesses them. By having multiple investigators watching simultaneously, the team increases the likelihood that any unexpected behavior can be confirmed independently rather than relying on a single interpretation. The experiment is based on a straightforward idea. If hidden underground spaces exist beneath Homestead Two, they could create subtle airflow patterns that are normally impossible to detect. Small openings in the ground, concealed fractures in the rock, or natural voids beneath the surface might allow air to move in ways that are not immediately obvious. Smoke drifting toward one location, sinking unexpectedly, or changing direction without an apparent cause could point investigators toward features hidden below ground. Pressure differences are another possibility. Variations in underground temperature or natural air circulation can sometimes create pressure gradients that gently pull or push air through narrow openings. In caves and abandoned mines, similar effects have occasionally been documented. While the team is not assuming that such conditions exist beneath Homestead Two, they recognize that smoke provides one of the clearest ways to detect them if they do. Environmental conditions receive just as much attention as the equipment itself. Even a light breeze can alter the movement of smoke, making ordinary airflow appear unusual. Temperature differences between the ground and the surrounding air can also influence how smoke rises or spreads. The investigators carefully observe wind direction, note the weather, and look for signs that changing conditions could interfere with the experiment. Natural obstacles are considered as well. Trees, shrubs, nearby structures, and uneven terrain can all redirect air currents in subtle ways. By identifying these features before the test begins, the team hopes to distinguish ordinary environmental influences from behavior that truly deserves further investigation. Throughout the preparations, conversations among the investigators remain measured and realistic. Some believe the experiment may simply confirm that the airflow around Homestead Two is entirely normal. Others wonder whether even a small irregularity could provide a valuable clue for future investigations. No one predicts exactly what they will see, but there is a shared understanding that even negative results contribute to the larger effort of understanding the ranch. The discussion also reflects a lesson learned from previous seasons. Complex instruments can sometimes produce confusing data that require extensive interpretation, but smoke offers something different. It creates an observation that everyone can witness together. If an unusual pattern develops, it will not exist only as numbers on a screen. It will unfold in plain sight, allowing every investigator to compare impressions immediately. As the final checks are completed, attention remains fixed on Homestead Two. Every expectation, every camera, and every observer is focused on this familiar location. Based on everything the team has experienced in the past, if anything unusual is about to happen, this is where they believe it will happen. None of them suspect that before long, the experiment will begin pointing away from Homestead Two altogether, redirecting their attention toward an entirely different part of the ranch and transforming a routine investigation into one of the episode's most unexpected developments. With every camera recording and each investigator in position, the smoke experiment finally begins. The opening moments unfold exactly as expected, reinforcing the team's confidence that the test has been set up correctly. A controlled stream of smoke is released near Homestead Two, rising gently before drifting with the light movement of the surrounding air. At first, there is nothing that appears unusual. The smoke climbs upward, thins as it spreads, and follows the subtle breeze across the landscape in a way that seems entirely consistent with normal environmental conditions. For several minutes, the investigators simply watch. This patience is an important part of the process. Rather than reacting to every slight change, they allow the smoke to establish a baseline pattern. By observing how it behaves under ordinary conditions, they create a point of comparison for anything that might happen later. Calm observation, not quick conclusions, is what gives the experiment its value. The first releases produce exactly the kind of movement everyone anticipated. Wisps of smoke drift naturally around vegetation, flow gently over uneven ground, and gradually dissipate into the open air. Nothing suggests hidden air currents or underground disturbances. If the experiment had ended at this stage, it would likely have been considered informative but uneventful. Then the pattern begins to change. One of the investigators notices that part of the smoke no longer follows the same path as the rest. Instead of continuing with the surrounding airflow, a small portion appears to hesitate, gathering in an area where it should have continued drifting away. At first, the observation seems so subtle that it could easily be dismissed. Small eddies and swirling pockets of air are common outdoors, especially in uneven terrain. The team resists the temptation to overreact. Rather than immediately describing the behavior as anomalous, they continue watching to see whether the effect repeats. Additional smoke is released under the same conditions. Once again, most of it behaves exactly as expected. Yet a similar interruption appears in nearly the same area. The smoke seems reluctant to move in the direction predicted by the prevailing breeze, lingering longer than anyone anticipated before shifting in an unexpected direction. Now several investigators begin paying closer attention. Different members of the team compare what they are seeing from separate viewing positions. Because they are standing at different angles, each observer has a slightly different perspective. Despite those differences, they begin describing remarkably similar behavior. The smoke is not simply dispersing randomly. Certain portions appear to respond differently from the surrounding air. To determine whether this is merely coincidence, the experiment continues. More smoke is introduced, giving the team another opportunity to observe the developing pattern. Again, much of the smoke follows ordinary airflow, but specific sections repeatedly display movement that seems inconsistent with the broader environmental conditions. At times, the smoke appears to collect briefly before dispersing. At other moments, it changes direction in ways that are not immediately explained by the gentle breeze affecting nearby vegetation. These observations immediately prompt careful discussion rather than dramatic conclusions. The investigators begin comparing the smoke's movement with everything else in the environment. They look at nearby trees to judge wind direction. They observe grasses and shrubs for signs of shifting air currents. If the wind were changing suddenly, those surrounding indicators should respond as well. Yet in several instances, the vegetation appears relatively stable while portions of the smoke continue displaying behavior that attracts attention. This does not automatically mean something extraordinary is occurring. Outdoor airflow is influenced by countless variables, many of which are invisible to the human eye. Slight changes in ground temperature, variations in terrain, small rock formations, or subtle differences in elevation can all redirect moving air. The investigators openly acknowledge these possibilities, recognizing that unusual does not necessarily mean unexplained. Even so, the repetition of the observations makes them difficult to ignore. What captures the team's attention is not a single dramatic movement, but the consistency with which similar behavior appears during repeated releases. Scientific investigations often depend less on spectacular moments than on patterns that continue to emerge under controlled conditions. Every additional release gives the investigators another chance to ask the same question. Is the smoke revealing something about the environment that they have not yet recognized? As the experiment progresses, another development begins shifting the team's focus. Some investigators notice that the most interesting smoke behavior does not remain confined to the exact area they originally intended to study. Instead, their attention starts drifting beyond the immediate surroundings of Homestead Two. Small changes in the smoke's movement seem to point toward a different section of the ranch, one that had not been the primary focus when the experiment began. This possibility introduces an entirely new layer of uncertainty. If the unusual movement is connected to hidden geological features, those features may extend farther than previously believed. Underground fractures, interconnected voids, or natural airflow channels can sometimes influence areas well beyond a single visible location. While the investigators cannot confirm such an explanation from this experiment alone, it becomes one possibility worth considering. Others remain cautious, suggesting that localized atmospheric conditions could still account for the observations. Until additional testing is performed, every interpretation remains provisional. That balanced approach prevents the investigation from moving beyond what the evidence actually supports. By now, however, one fact has become clear to everyone present. What began as a straightforward attempt to study Homestead Two is no longer confined to that location. The smoke has raised new questions instead of providing simple answers, and the team's attention is beginning to shift toward an area they never expected to investigate. In typical Skinwalker Ranch fashion, the simplest experiment of the day has opened the door to an even larger mystery. What happens next changes the entire direction of the investigation. Until this point, every plan, every camera position, and every expectation has centered on Homestead Two. The experiment was designed to answer questions about one specific location. Instead, the observations begin pointing investigators toward a place that was never intended to become the focus of the day. The shift is gradual rather than dramatic. As additional smoke is released and the team carefully compares each result, attention begins moving beyond the immediate boundaries of Homestead Two. The investigators notice that some of the most interesting behavior seems to align with a different section of the ranch. While the smoke itself is still being observed near the original test site, the overall pattern encourages the team to look farther afield, asking whether the unusual airflow could be influenced by something extending well beyond the area they had planned to study. Rather than dismissing the possibility, they decide to investigate it. This decision reflects one of the team's guiding principles throughout the Skinwalker Ranch investigation. Experiments are designed with a specific goal in mind, but the evidence must always determine the next step. If observations begin leading in an unexpected direction, the investigation has to follow them instead of forcing the results to fit the original plan. That willingness to adapt has become increasingly important over the years. Several previous investigations have shown that unexpected discoveries often emerge only after the team abandons its initial assumptions. In this episode, the smoke experiment appears to be following that familiar pattern. Instead of confirming or disproving a theory about Homestead Two, it raises the possibility that the most significant clue lies somewhere else entirely. The new area immediately attracts attention because it has not been the primary target of the day's investigation. Everyone expected the critical observations to occur close to Homestead Two, where years of previous anomalies had justified another round of testing. Instead, the developing pattern suggests that whatever is influencing the smoke may not be confined to a single location. This possibility forces the investigators to think differently. If the observations are connected to underground geological features, then those features could extend across a much larger portion of the ranch than previously believed. Natural fractures in rock, buried channels, or hidden cavities rarely exist in isolation. They often form interconnected systems that stretch considerable distances beneath the surface. Although no one can confirm such a network based solely on this experiment, the idea immediately becomes part of the discussion. The team also considers whether subtle environmental factors might extend farther than expected. Air pressure differences, changes in elevation, underground temperature variations, or concealed openings could all influence airflow across multiple locations rather than a single isolated point. Once again, these remain possibilities rather than conclusions, but they help explain why investigators refuse to ignore what they are seeing. As conversations continue, comparisons between the two locations become increasingly important. Homestead Two remains the historical center of the investigation, supported by years of unusual reports and repeated experimentation. The second location, however, represents something different. It was not selected because of past expectations. It earned attention because the current experiment appeared to point investigators toward it. That distinction matters. Scientific investigations are generally strongest when evidence directs researchers toward new questions instead of simply reinforcing existing beliefs. Had the team ignored the developing anomaly because it lay outside their original objective, they might have overlooked an important clue. By allowing the observations themselves to influence their decisions, they preserve the integrity of the investigation, even if it means rewriting the day's plans. The reactions among team members reveal both excitement and restraint. some investigators expressed genuine curiosity, recognizing that an unexpected result can sometimes become the most valuable outcome of an experiment. Others remain more cautious, reminding the group that unusual observations require careful verification before they can be interpreted with confidence. This balance between curiosity and skepticism has become one of the defining characteristics of the ranch's ongoing investigations. Every unexpected development generates new possibilities, but each possibility must eventually withstand repeated testing. A single experiment can point investigators in a promising direction, but it cannot provide definitive answers on its own. Even so, there is a growing sense that the day's work has uncovered something worth pursuing. The smoke experiment has done more than visualize airflow. It has challenged the assumption that Homestead Two should always be considered in isolation. Instead, the observations encourage the team to view the ranch as a connected landscape where one location may influence another in ways that are not immediately visible. That idea introduces one of the episode's most intriguing questions. Could seemingly separate areas of Skinwalker Ranch actually be linked by hidden geological structures, natural airflow systems, or other environmental processes that have yet to be fully understood? If so, previous investigations may represent individual pieces of a much larger puzzle rather than isolated mysteries. By the end of this phase of the investigation, the original objective has quietly transformed. What began as an effort to study a single homestead has expanded into a broader search for connections across the ranch itself. Instead of narrowing the mystery, the smoke experiment has widened it, suggesting that the answers investigators seek may lie not in one location, but in the relationships between many. With the field experiment complete, the investigation enters a different phase. The excitement of watching the smoke unfold in real time gives way to a slower, more methodical process, comparing what was observed against everything the team has documented during previous seasons. On Skinwalker Ranch, no experiment exists in isolation. Every new observation is measured against years of accumulated data, because investigators understand that meaningful discoveries often emerge from recurring patterns rather than from a single dramatic event. The smoke experiment has raised fresh questions, but by itself it cannot answer them. Its real value depends on whether similar clues have appeared before. The team begins reviewing earlier investigations involving Homestead Two and nearby areas of the ranch. They recall locations where instruments detected unexpected changes in environmental conditions, where equipment behaved unpredictably, or where repeated tests produced readings that investigators found difficult to explain. Although each experiment used different methods and pursued different objectives, the question now becomes whether those seemingly unrelated events share a common thread. This comparison is one of the most important aspects of the scientific process. A single unusual result can be caused by countless variables, many of them completely ordinary. But when multiple experiments conducted at different times begin pointing towards similar locations or similar environmental behavior, investigators have stronger reason to continue exploring those areas. The discussion naturally turns to geology. Skinwalker Ranch sits within a landscape shaped by layers of rock, natural faults, changing elevations, and complex underground formations. Geological structures can influence airflow, moisture movement, temperature distribution, and even the way certain instruments respond under specific conditions. Hidden fractures beneath the surface may allow air to travel in unexpected directions, while underground cavities could create subtle pressure differences capable of affecting the movement of smoke. These possibilities are entirely consistent with known natural processes. Similar effects have been documented in cave systems, lava tubes, and fractured rock formations in many parts of the world. If something comparable exists beneath sections of the ranch, it could help explain why simple visual observations occasionally appear unusual. Atmospheric conditions receive equal attention. Even on relatively calm days, the atmosphere is rarely motionless. Slight temperature differences between sunlit ground and shaded areas can produce localized air currents that are almost impossible to detect without a visible tracer such as smoke. Variations in humidity, thermal activity, and changes in terrain can all combine to create airflow patterns that seem surprising at first glance. The investigators recognize that these environmental influences must be carefully evaluated before considering more extraordinary explanations. The conversation also includes the ranch's long history of unusual electronic readings. Previous investigations have sometimes documented unexpected instrument behavior, intermittent signal disruptions, or measurements that appeared inconsistent with surrounding conditions. While this episode's smoke experiment does not directly measure electromagnetic activity, some team members wonder whether the locations attracting attention today overlap with areas where unusual readings have been recorded before. That possibility is intriguing, but it remains only a hypothesis. Correlation alone does not establish causation. Two unusual observations occurring in the same general area do not necessarily arise from the same source. Recognizing this limitation is essential if the investigation is to remain grounded in careful analysis rather than speculation. At the same time, the unique reputation of Skinwalker Ranch inevitably brings broader theories into the discussion. Over the years, the property has become associated with claims ranging from unusual atmospheric phenomena to ideas involving unknown energy sources or other extraordinary possibilities. While such theories capture public imagination, the investigators understand that they cannot substitute for measurable evidence. This episode reflects that distinction clearly. The smoke observations are presented as genuine points of interest, not as proof of any particular explanation. The team repeatedly acknowledges that additional experiments will be necessary before drawing meaningful conclusions. Every interpretation remains provisional, subject to revision as new information becomes available. That measured approach is one of the strengths of the investigation. Rather than allowing a single experiment to dictate the narrative, the team focuses on identifying repeatable patterns. If similar observations continue appearing across different tests, under different environmental conditions, and using different investigative methods, confidence in those patterns gradually increases. If future experiments fail to reproduce today's results, the investigators must be equally willing to reconsider their assumptions. By the end of their review, one conclusion stands out above all others. The smoke experiment has become valuable not because it solved a mystery, but because it added another piece to a growing collection of observations. On its own, that piece reveals very little. Combined with years of previous investigations, however, it may help outline a larger picture that is only beginning to come into focus. For the team, this is the real purpose of returning to the ranch again and again. Individual experiments may succeed or fail, but each one contributes to a broader effort to understand whether the recurring anomalies scattered across Skinwalker Ranch are isolated coincidences or interconnected parts of the same enduring mystery. As the immediate excitement of the fieldwork begins to fade, the investigators gather to discuss what they have observed. These conversations are often just as important as the experiments themselves. Away from the distractions of the active test, the team has an opportunity to compare notes, challenge one another's interpretations, and decide which observations deserve further attention. In many ways, this careful exchange of ideas becomes the bridge between an interesting event and a meaningful investigation. One of the first things that becomes apparent is that no one rushes to declare a definitive explanation. Although everyone witnessed the same smoke experiment, each investigator approaches the results from a slightly different perspective. That diversity of opinion has become one of the team's greatest strengths. Rather than expecting complete agreement, they recognize that different backgrounds naturally lead to different interpretations. Some members focus on the environmental aspects of what they witnessed. From their perspective, the unusual smoke behavior could still be explained by subtle airflow patterns that have not yet been fully identified. They point out that outdoor environments are remarkably complex, with countless variables interacting at the same time. Even under seemingly calm conditions, invisible currents can develop because of terrain, vegetation, temperature differences, or hidden geological features. For these investigators, caution remains essential before assigning too much significance to a single observation. Others are more intrigued by the consistency of the results. They note that the smoke did not behave unpredictably just once. Instead, similar patterns appeared during repeated releases, encouraging them to believe that something measurable may be influencing the experiment. While they stop well short of proposing extraordinary explanations, they argue that recurring observations deserve closer examination rather than being dismissed as coincidence. These differing viewpoints do not create conflict. Instead, they produce constructive discussion. Each interpretation forces the others to consider possibilities they may have overlooked. The team understands that the goal is not to defend personal theories, but to test them against the available evidence. That willingness to question one another respectfully is one of the reasons the investigation continues to evolve from season to season. As the conversation deepens, attention shifts from the smoke itself to the broader implications of the experiment. The investigators recognize that the most important outcome may not be the specific movement they observed, but the questions it raises about the ranch as a whole. Why did the experiment appear to redirect attention toward another location? Could separate areas of the property be connected through hidden geological structures or environmental processes? Or did the day's observations simply reveal how much remains unknown about the landscape they have been studying for years? These questions prove far more significant than any immediate conclusion. Throughout the discussion, there is a shared recognition that Skinwalker Ranch has repeatedly challenged expectations. Time after time, experiments designed to answer one question have uncovered entirely different mysteries. Instead of producing clear conclusions, investigations often expand the scope of inquiry, revealing new locations, new anomalies, or new relationships that no one anticipated at the outset. This recurring pattern is both encouraging and frustrating. On one hand, every unexpected observation offers another opportunity to learn something new. On the other, each discovery reminds the investigators that the ranch continues to resist simple explanations. Progress is measured not by solving every mystery, but by gradually refining the questions that guide future experiments. The emotional tone of these discussions reflects years of experience rather than excitement over a single event. There is genuine curiosity around the table, but it is tempered by patience. The investigators know that remarkable claims require equally remarkable evidence, and they are careful not to allow enthusiasm to outpace the facts. At the same time, they also understand that dismissing unusual observations too quickly can be just as damaging as accepting them without sufficient proof. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the conversation is the sense of humility it reveals. Despite years of studying the ranch with increasingly sophisticated tools, the team openly acknowledges how much remains beyond their current understanding. That admission is not a sign of failure. Instead, it reflects the very nature of scientific investigation, where every answer often uncovers another layer of questions waiting to be explored. By the close of the discussion, no one claims to have solved the mystery presented in Up in Smoke. Instead, the investigators leave with something arguably more valuable, a clearer sense that the observations from this episode belong to a much larger puzzle. Each experiment adds another piece. Each comparison reveals another possible connection, and each unanswered question points toward future investigations. Rather than closing the book on Homestead Two or the newly identified area of interest, the team recognizes that the story of these locations is still unfolding, one careful experiment at a time. As the investigators reflect on everything they observed during the smoke experiment, the conversation naturally turns toward one of the most important questions raised by the episode. What, if anything, could have caused the unusual behavior they witnessed? While the observations were certainly intriguing, the team understands that identifying a possible explanation requires separating what was actually seen from what can only be speculated. The first possibilities they examine are the most conventional ones. One of the leading ideas involves hidden underground spaces. Beneath the surface, natural voids can develop over thousands of years through erosion, shifting rock, or other geological processes. Even relatively small cavities may influence the movement of air, particularly if they connect to narrow fractures or openings that reach the surface. Under the right conditions, these concealed spaces can create subtle pressure differences capable of redirecting smoke in ways that appear surprising to an observer standing above ground. Closely related to this possibility is the idea of underground airflow channels. In some landscapes, air travels through networks of cracks, porous rock, or interconnected cavities, creating movement that remains invisible until a tracer such as smoke makes it apparent. If a similar system exists beneath parts of Skinwalker Ranch, it could help explain why sections of the smoke occasionally behave differently from the surrounding air. Terrain itself is another important consideration. Although the ranch may appear relatively open, small changes in elevation can significantly influence local airflow. Gentle slopes, shallow depressions, clusters of vegetation, rock outcrops, and nearby structures all have the potential to redirect moving air in subtle ways. These influences often become noticeable only when conditions are calm enough for smoke to reveal patterns that otherwise go unnoticed. What initially appears unusual can sometimes be traced back to surprisingly ordinary features of the landscape. The investigators also consider whether the geology beneath the ranch might be more complex than surface observations suggest. Layers of fractured rock, buried faults, or variations in soil composition can affect temperature, moisture, and airflow in ways that are difficult to predict without extensive surveying. If several of these geological factors overlap in the same area, they could produce localized conditions that are far more complicated than any single explanation would suggest. Even so, none of these possibilities fully accounts for everything the team observed. Each explanation answers certain questions while leaving others unresolved. Underground voids might influence airflow, but they do not automatically explain why attention shifted toward another area of the ranch. Terrain features can redirect smoke, yet investigators remain uncertain whether the observed behavior matches what would normally be expected from the visible landscape alone. Geological complexity is certainly possible, but confirming its role would require additional testing beyond what was conducted during this episode. Because of these limitations, the team begins considering whether the answer may involve several natural processes acting together rather than one isolated cause. In the natural world, complex behavior often emerges from the interaction of multiple factors. Slight variations in air pressure, changing ground temperatures, concealed fractures, uneven terrain, and localized weather conditions can combine to produce results that appear highly unusual when viewed individually. What seems mysterious at first may ultimately prove to be the product of several ordinary influences occurring at precisely the same time. This possibility is especially appealing because it reflects how many scientific puzzles are eventually resolved. Rarely does a single cause explain every observation. More often, investigators discover that several independent processes interact in ways that were not immediately obvious during the initial experiment. At the same time, the team remains careful not to force the evidence into any preferred explanation. One of the recurring themes throughout the investigation is the importance of resisting premature conclusions. It is tempting to embrace the first theory that appears to fit the available observations, but doing so can prevent researchers from recognizing alternative possibilities that later evidence might support more convincingly. That caution also extends to the more unusual ideas often associated with Skinwalker Ranch. The property's history has inspired countless theories involving unexplained forces and extraordinary phenomena. While the investigators acknowledge that the ranch has produced observations they continue to study, they are equally clear that this episode does not provide definitive evidence supporting any extraordinary claim. The smoke experiment raises important questions, but it does not settle the debate. By the end of their analysis, the investigators arrive at a conclusion that is both honest and scientifically responsible. Several natural explanations remain plausible. Some appear stronger than others, yet none fully accounts for every aspect of the day's observations. Rather than viewing this uncertainty as a setback, the team sees it as a guide for future research. Each unanswered question helps shape the next experiment, bringing them one step closer to understanding whether the unusual behavior witnessed in Up in Smoke reflects hidden geological processes, complex environmental interactions, or something that has yet to be discovered. By the conclusion of the day's investigation, it becomes clear that Up in Smoke is significant not because it delivers a definitive breakthrough, but because it changes the direction of the search itself. The team's original objective was focused almost entirely on Homestead Two. Every piece of equipment, every observation, and every expectation had been organized around understanding one familiar location. Yet by following the evidence rather than the plan, The investigators find themselves considering an entirely different part of the ranch as a potential source of future discoveries.